right, guys. Good morning. It's a beautiful day outside. It's finally like spring, summer. Feels like we can get on with life now. Snow's done. I won't say that too loud. I think the snow's done. I planted the last seed of corn yesterday on our farm, so got a little bit of beans to go yet, but that was a milestone. So I'm in a good mood today. All right, so we have our summary we wrote last time, Genesis 47:27 through 50:14, and that was that Jacob blesses Manasseh and Ephraim as his own sons. Jacob calls his 12 sons together to give them blessings and prophecies of what will happen in the days to come. Jacob dies and they travel back to Canaan for the burial. And our summary was, Jacob makes Joseph swear to bury him in Canaan in the cave that Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite. Jacob claims Manasseh and Ephraim as his own sons. Then he asks them, "Who are you?" And Jacob blesses Joseph through his sons. Jacob puts Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. He gave extra portions to Joseph. Jacob blesses and curses all the other sons around the bed before his death. The right to rule stays with Judah until Christ, and Jacob dies, is embalmed, and head back to Canaan for burial with a big parade. So that's going in the bucket. That was good. Now, got a title from James this week for the end of Genesis, the last few verses, Genesis 50:15 through 50:26. So the title was, Joseph assures his brothers they need not fear him with their father now dead. Joseph now dies and makes his family swear to carry his bones out when they leave Egypt someday. So it's a pretty short section. I don't know if there's anything else that really happens in there. Is there? Maybe we'll leave that one at the title. How's that sound? Okay. Remember, the point of this class was repetition. So the more times we see it, the more likely that is to stick, or at least the way I view it is you have a sort of box in your head that you call Genesis, right? And from the outside, you can remember there's a Genesis box and that you have some feelings about what happens in there. But when you start talking about something that relates to Genesis, you zoom in and you find other boxes inside the Genesis box, right? That in your head, the point of this repetition is that you could zoom in from the outside. There's not just a book of Genesis, there's this thing. And then, oh yeah, in Jacob's life, these are the things that happen, kind of in this order. So that's the purpose of our repetition here. So with that said, it's time to write our final summary, bucket number 2. So bucket number 1, if you remember, was the creation, fall, the flood, and Babel. And bucket number 2 was Abraham, the Hebrews, and Israel, and Egypt. So we are ending the Egypt bucket in Genesis, about to begin the Exodus, leaving Egypt over there. And so what we did last time, I thought it worked okay, was this week you guys have an assignment, should you choose to accept it. And that is, write a half-page to one-page summary of Genesis. Send it in Slack. If you don't want to send it publicly, send it to me privately. I will take them all together and try to make a half, three-quarter page summary of Genesis from all of you guys' summaries. That act of going back through it is what's going to help cement that in your brain. When you go back through it, you'll realize which stuff you are forgetting, and that act is what makes you remember it. So, this is blank for now, but I thought to get us started, I just grabbed the titles out of every summary we had done, and I threw them all here. And I thought we could just do our quick summary of Genesis, going through all those titles. And then after that, if you scroll down far enough, there's a couple pages of titles, then every single summary we wrote is at the bottom. And I'm going to post this document in Slack for you guys this week. So you can go back through as you're writing your summary to see what we came up with in class. Okay? So let's go back through our titles. Everything that happens from, this was Genesis 12, right? Genesis 1 through 11, creation of the world. And then 12 through 50, one family, Abraham's family. So, the class number 7, our title was, God calls out Abram through the Abrahamic covenant before Abram goes to Egypt, after which he has to save Lot in the slaughter of the kings, resulting in Melchizedek's blessing. Remember that? God makes a covenant with Abram, promising to multiply greatly both Isaac and Ishmael, but Hagar runs away and God brings her back. God reaffirms the Abrahamic covenant through changing Abraham and Sarah's name before Abraham argues with God over destroying the righteous with the wicked in Sodom, after which Lot escapes to a cave with his daughters, who bear his children as the fathers of the Moabite and the Ammonite peoples. The sister trick again with Abimelech before Isaac is born, resulting in a treaty where Abraham owns Beersheba, and then Abraham's faith is tested with the command to sacrifice his only son. Sarah and Abraham die, and Isaac gets a wife and sons. Isaac deals with the Philistines, digs wells, is comforted by God's direct promise, and is deceived by Rebekah and Jacob. So there is dealing, digging, directed, and deceived. Jacob's deception gets him Esau's blessing, but forces him to Laban through Bethel. Laban deceives Jacob for his wives and livestock, while Rachel and Leah compete over love and kids. Jacob and his family flee Laban with God's help, only for him to wrestle with God, emerging as a limping Israel as Esau takes up the chase. Turns out Esau is nice, but Jacob moves on. Dana is defiled, Shechem is slaughtered, Bethel blessing, and Rachel R.I.P. The descendants of Esau, known as Edom, and Joseph's dreams get him thrown into a pit by his brothers and sold into slavery. Jacob identifies Joseph's bloodstained robe. Tamar deceives Judah to get herself a child after Judah fails to give her his final son. Joseph is unjustly accused by Potiphar's wife and put in jail. Joseph interprets dreams in prison. The cupbearer forgets and remembers Joseph, leading Pharaoh to put Joseph in charge of all Egypt. Joseph prepared Egypt for famine, attracting his brothers to buy food, and Joseph tests them to get Benjamin to Egypt. Joseph's brothers are tested, and it's found that Benjamin has the silver cup. Joseph reveals who he is, and Pharaoh sends them back to get their families. Jacob finds out Joseph is alive, and he and his family pack up and go settle in Goshen, and there they are reunited. Then we had the dual title week, which was Jacob's family settles in Goshen with Pharaoh's permission as shepherds, while famine continues, with Joseph exchanging food for everyone's livestock and buying all their land for Pharaoh, except for the land of the priests. Or, Pharaoh gets extremely rich, and Joseph sets his family up for success. Jacob blesses Manasseh and Ephraim as his own sons. Jacob calls his 12 sons together to give them blessings and prophecies of what will happen in the days to come. Jacob dies, and they travel back to Canaan for the burial. And Joseph assures his brothers they need not fear him with their father now dead. Joseph now dies and makes his family swear to carry his bones out when they leave Egypt someday. Well, that's a pretty good summary, even though it's just the titles. So I'll send that around to you guys. Nice job on those overall. I don't know about you, but I feel like I lived with these people for the last 20 weeks. Of course, I'm studying up all week long, so maybe it's a little bit more, but still, it's that's one thing I love about Genesis, is you can really get involved in this story. These are characters that you can learn to love and hate and identify with, and just great. So, that's the end of our summary from last time. So now we're going to get started with Exodus chapter 1. So as you guys turn there, I wanted to bring up a point that it came up in another conversation somewhere else. I thought it was worth talking about. You guys know in the New Testament a few times, Paul, Peter, and the writer of Hebrews all tells us about how as Christians there's an infancy phase where we're drinking milk, and then there's an adult phase where we get to eat meat, milk and meat, or solid food as sometimes it's translated. This class is the meat phase of that, all right? I hope you guys feel that as we've been going through, that I have felt filled up reading Genesis this way. I can actually feel the nourishment, the spiritual nourishment from that book. And so we're in the meat phase here, so we should all leave very, very full, maybe ready for a nap. Not till after Jeremy's sermon, but after that. But as we jump into Exodus here, the mindset I want us to take is that we are reading this to learn about God. That's why we're reading it. Just think of all of the millions of people up to this point before Exodus was written who wished to know something about God, who wished God would reveal something about themselves. They're stuck guessing. They didn't have this. Moses didn't have this when God spoke to him to tell him about God's properties and who he is. And so, how exciting is it? We're about to go into this phase where God's about to tell us about himself. And he does not turn out to be how we imagine him to be. Right? So we're jumping into here, and as we read this, don't read this like I have a preconceived notion of God, and now I'm going to try to fit the text into my box that I've put God into. Read this as God is revealing to you something about himself here. It's there for you to learn, not for you to critique or evaluate. Like, you're supposed to learn from it, not the other way around. So let's start. Exodus 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. And then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So, about how many people were there? The best guess we have is in Numbers, when they leave Egypt, we take a census. And there's 603,550, or about 600,000 men of fighting age. This is between 20 and 50. So if you double that for their wives, for the women, it's about half men, half women. And then you add in children and elderly people who are outside that range of fighting age. We're talking approximately 2 million people. So that's about how many people were there when they left. And so if that's about how many people were there now, you could see why Pharaoh might be getting a little antsy about this at that time. But there was a really interesting point made by Dennis Prager that this fear of there being way more Jews than there actually are is very common in all of history. Everywhere Jews have ever lived, everyone in that society thinks there are way more Jews than there actually are. So in the United States, we have 280 million people, and the total number of Jews is 6 million, about 2%. And back in, what year was it? I didn't write the year down. Just in the last couple decades, they did some polls asking people how many Jews they thought there were in the world and in the United States. And the average guess was 30%. 15 times the number of Jews that there actually were. In the entire world, there are only 16 million Jews. 6 million of the 16 million live in the United States. So of the 8 billion people in the world, that's 0.2% of the world's population. And they live in a country that's smaller than the size of New Jersey. And the world is obsessed with them. The world is convinced they control everything. And so they have this outsized view of how many Jews there actually are. They see Jews behind every corner. It has not ended since the Pharaoh. What the Pharaoh began is still here in our day. So, verse 8. This is a very big verse. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And as I've said before, that verse always gets followed with a dirge. Dun, dun, dun. Like this is ominous. Who is this Pharaoh? That's my first question. Who is the guy? The Bible doesn't tell us. So let's look at a little history. I've been stuck in Egyptian history for the last 2 weeks. But it actually, I found a thread that I think makes sense and helps explain almost the entire Exodus story. 1446 is our date for the Exodus, right? You pick different dates, other things. These don't necessarily work out the same way. But if we took 1446 as the Exodus, and Exodus 12 tells us they were 430 years in Egypt before the Exodus. And so that puts us back at, I'm not going to try to do the math on the board this time since I failed so miserably before, about 1876, right? Yeah, 1876 BC. This is when they came into Egypt, the Exodus, if that's the case. And so if we look at our overall, this is this zoomed in for you guys so that you can see it later. So 1876 is right about over here. This is the Joseph era, and where we're talking about the actual Exodus happening is right here in this 18th dynasty of Egypt. And so we're going to go over these pharaohs here in a bit. But the first one is 1876. That's Joseph. That's everybody coming in. And then 1650 BC. The next important thing. A word you should not forget, because this is the word that explains what happens to the Hebrews. The Hyksos. Over the course of time, from actually about this time into this era, there had been a slow mass migration of Semitic peoples from Canaan and the surrounding areas into Egypt. And so it reached a point where they were a good chunk of the overall population. Not the Hebrews, I mean just all the Semitic peoples in that land. And in 1650, the first Canaanite Pharaoh became leader of Egypt. And so this is when the Canaanites took over Egypt. And the series of pharaohs after that point were called the Hyksos. And so the Canaanites, the Semitic peoples, are ruling the Egyptians for quite some time. Until 1570 BC, the start of this 18th dynasty. This is Ahmose the First. This guy kicks the Hyksos out. So this guy takes the reign of the Canaanites that the Egyptian natives have become just completely disgusted with, kicks them out, and becomes the ruler of Egypt again. Now we have a true Egyptian ruling. And at this point is where the racial pride gets instantiated. This point, after they kicked out the Canaanites, is about why it's so important to be an Egyptian, why it's so important to have that Egyptian pedigree. And we hate the Canaanites because we just kicked them out. The Hebrews were not part of this, because remember, they were shepherds. So they got stuck over in their own corner of Egypt. So they were Semitic peoples. They were from Canaan. So you can see how the Egyptian mindset might have gradually moved from, we're Egyptians, we're the best, we hate the Canaanites, to, wait, these guys came from Canaan too, they're also Semitic, they just happen to be shepherds. Now I hate them even more. And so it was that spike in racial pride that happened with Ahmose the First that really eventually drives the oppression of the Hebrews. So 1503 BC. So this was Ahmose the First. We have a few other pharaohs I'm not going to talk about. We're going to jump over here to Queen Hatshepsut. That's my best pronunciation of her name. We have Ahmose, Amenhotep, Thutmose II. He dies. His daughter, Queen Hatshepsut, takes over 1504 or 1503 BC is actually when she starts to reign. Hatshepsut. There was only 4 female pharaohs in all of Egyptian's history, and this one was the best one. She actually was a relatively peaceful reign. She actually was a really great leader. But she ruled at the same time as Thutmose III, because when Thutmose II, Queen Hatshepsut's half-brother, who she had married, died, Thutmose III, who was going to succeed him, was only 2 or 3 years old. And that's why his reign is 51 years, because he started reigning at 2 years old, but the person who was really reigning was Queen Hatshepsut as his regent, effectively, in his place. And she puts him in charge of the military. And this is the one fatal mistake that leads to a complete change in the Egyptian culture.
Was that his mother?
It was not his mother, no, it was his aunt. But it doesn't say anywhere in the Egyptian records that she actually raised him, but you can see that they would have been working closely together because she's using his power to rule, basically. And she did a good job. And she put him in charge of the military. If you remember last time, I said that the Egyptian culture and government was set up around this 3-pronged stool of the priest, the military, and pharaoh. Right? That was how their government's power was split. What Hatshepsut did was put Thutmose, as he was growing up, in charge of the military, and she was pharaoh. And then when she dies, he now is controlling 2 branches of the 3 branches of government. And he capitalizes on the hatred of the Canaanites and the fact that we've kicked them out about 100 years earlier. It's time for empire. And so the Egyptians that never went outside their borders before this point now embark on a massive campaign to take over the surrounding peoples. And that's what happens under Thutmose III. And so, what age did I use for him? I used 1504. The reason that we should remember Thutmose III is that is the pharaoh that enslaved the Hebrews. The guy who had control of everything, the guy who changed the Egyptian culture in this massive, massive quest of empire, at the same time says, you know what, these other Canaanite guys over here, we should actually enslave them. And so he's the guy who did all the bad stuff. He's the baby killer that we're about to get to. After him then, you should know, he was no slouch at empire. He never lost a battle that's ever recorded. 350 battles, he won every single one. And he took over from Egypt to the Euphrates River. You remember how big that area is? All of Canaan, all of Israel. Egypt ruled it during this period. So then the guy who came after him happened in 1453. He is Amenhotep II. That's the guy who had the plagues. That's the Pharaoh who got the 10 plagues and ended up having his whole army drowned in the Red Sea, Amenhotep II. And what's interesting, I think, about this is, first, one of the reasons you know Thutmose III is the Exodus Pharaoh is that Moses went to the land of Midian to hide from Pharaoh for 40 years. The only guy who ruled long enough in this era to actually have been Pharaoh for 40 years was Thutmose III. And so that's another indication that we're on the right track here. The guy that followed him, Amenhotep II, we actually have his mummy. There he is. That's the Exodus Pharaoh. He's in a museum somewhere in Egypt right now. And do you see these little bumps? No other pharaoh's mummies that we've ever found have these little bumps. And the guys who have evaluated what the little bumps are is they seem to be boils. They call them tubercules. As in, we had a plague where the Pharaoh had a bunch of boils all over him, and so did the rest of the people in Egypt, and we find his body and they're still there. I think that's pretty cool. You know what else happened to that Pharaoh? Was his eldest son died. Buried in his tomb with him was a 13-year-old prince that was his firstborn, Wabinsenu, laying between two other servants. And Wabinsenu, this was the artist's rendering of that when the guy found this tomb in the Valley of the Kings. And Wabinsenu was the firstborn son who died. And so we found a pharaoh with boils who reigned at the right time, and his son is buried in his tomb with him, which means his son preceded him in death because they sealed the tombs off after the pharaoh's dead. So if you're interested in that, there's a guy named Joel Kramer on YouTube who does Expedition Bible. I'll post a couple of videos of his. He goes over this in detail, actually goes to this tomb, walks through it today. It's locked. Most people can't get in there. He manages to get in there. It's actually really cool. So, that is Amenhotep. That's the pharaoh. So Thutmose III is the pharaoh that did not know Joseph. Amenhotep II is the pharaoh of the Exodus. (1205 BC). Merneptah Stele shows up. 1896. There's a guy excavating an area in Egypt, and he finds a 10-foot tall black piece of granite that they call a stele. And they would use these in ancient times to record their victories in war. And this stele, actually right down here, is the earliest recorded reference in anything outside the Bible to the nation of Israel. So this was the first mention of Israel in anything that we found up to that point, and it was during the reign of Merneptah. So Amenhotep III started this thing, and Merneptah finished it later on. And so during the reign of Merneptah in 1205 BC, he writes of all of his conquests. And there's a specific line on there that says, Canaan is plundered, Ashkelon is carried off, Gezer is seized, Yanoam is made non-existent, Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. So they've been out of Egypt long enough to be considered a people worth conquering, right? They had a battle with Egypt. And there is actually a hieroglyph representing peoples that have a government and a king. And that hieroglyph is used for all the other cities mentioned in that passage. And there's a different hieroglyph representing peoples who don't have a king. They're just a people, but they don't have an overarching government. That's the hieroglyph used with Israel on the Maranatha Stele. This is the period of the judges, where the Bible tells us over and over and over, in those days there was no king in Israel. And so this thing found completely validates the record of the Bible. And it's the earliest reference to Israel that we have so far. So, I thought that was cool. And then it all starts to fall apart for the Egyptians. 1200 BC, the sea peoples start to show up. So a large group of sort of misfits from Greece and some of the surrounding East or Southern European countries, 1200 BC, they start coming across the Mediterranean and landing on the coast. And they start attacking the Egyptians. The Egyptians are trying to hang on to their empire. They've been struggling to keep something so big around. And they beat the Sea Peoples in 1170 under Ramses III. And then the Sea Peoples take all 5 coastal cities and control the entire coastal plain along the Via Maris in 1150. And those Sea Peoples became the Philistines. And so it's the Philistines that effectively kicked Egypt out of Canaan. And by 1070 BC, the empire is done completely. It was declining up to that point and it's over. And then in our story, 1000 BC, David becomes king. He's now fighting the Philistines that kicked the Egyptians out. And we hear nothing about Egypt through Saul's reign, through David's reign, because they have essentially lost their empire and they completely turn back inward again, until we hit Solomon. And we hear about Solomon marrying Pharaoh's daughter. And Solomon marries Pharaoh's daughter. That's when Egypt shows back up on the scene 100 years later. They're ready to actually interact with the world, but it's not empire, it's treaties. So that history is the pharaohs and everybody that we're about to read in this story. Isn't that cool? I had no idea that stuff lined up so well. The Hyksos was a big light bulb for me, right? Like, knowing that the Canaanites were ruling the Egyptians and then they kicked them out, now it makes sense that the Hebrews became their slaves. All right, back to the text. Verse 9. The Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. And then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah, "When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live." I'm going to pause there for a little bit. So why were the Egyptians afraid of the Hebrews? The reason
Because there were too many of them?
Because there were too many of them, but there's many reasons you could be afraid of a big people. In this case, they weren't afraid of the Hebrews attacking them. They were afraid of the Hebrews joining their enemies in their empire, right? And so, where were the Hebrews at? Sorry, I forgot to bring up Google Earth. How could I forget that? Let's go there really quick. Remember where the Hebrews were at? They formed the eastern border of Egypt. And so where are all their invaders going to come from? This way. And so the Pharaoh is terribly concerned, especially since they hate the Canaanites and they've kicked them out, that the Canaanites are going to be coming back. And they're worried that the Hebrews are going to join with the Canaanites, and then they don't stand a chance. And so to add to the evil, you notice what it does not say in there. It does not say we have a whole bunch of work we need done and we just don't want to do it, so we're going to make them do it. No, they didn't need the work done. It was purely to torture them, to break their spirit. It was purely to make them suffer. They were not only suffering, they were suffering at pointless work, like to add insult to injury. And so you wonder, so Dennis Prager actually made this point, or well, he pointed out to me that there was a 19th century German Jewish rabbi, Raphael Hirsch, who pointed out that it was the Egyptian leader you see here, not the Egyptian people, who initiated the evils perpetrated against the Israelites. And you wonder, how does one person affect so much evil, right? And the terrible truth, this is from Dennis Prager, the terrible truth is that individuals are far more capable of doing great evil than they are of doing great good. You just look at the last 100 years, 150 years of human history. I mean, Hitler, Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot. I don't know if you guys know all those names. If you know Hitler's name, Stalin killed twice as many people as Hitler. Mao Zedong killed twice as many people as Stalin. All in the name of godless communism. And they weren't people in war. They weren't soldiers. They were civilians. They were just families, human beings, normal people. Pol Pot, he gets honorable mention because at the same time he killed 25% of the entire population of Cambodia to bring them under the reign of communism. Understand that in just a 100-year period, those few men were responsible for about 150 million people's deaths. That's more people than were killed in all of the religious wars in all of humanity since Christ combined. All the religious wars, somewhere between 20 and 50 million people died. 3 times at least that number of people were killed in peacetime by the godless regimes of the last century. Without those kind of individuals at the heads of hierarchical organizations, such massive evil is not possible. And if we want to understand Pharaoh in Egypt, we do not have to go back 2,000, 4,000 years. We only need to go back to the 1900s. So back in the late 1800s, there was a philosopher, an Enlightenment philosopher, he was an atheist, named Friedrich Nietzsche. Has anybody heard of Friedrich Nietzsche before? Just get an idea.
I've heard the last name.
You've heard okay, you know the last name, Nietzsche. So his most famous statement in his philosophic writing was, "God is dead and we have killed him." And his point was that the Enlightenment had essentially removed God from public discourse in the Western civilization public square. It's not there anymore. But he made a prediction, an inadvertent prediction, that actually if we had just listened to him, we could have avoided those 150 million people's deaths. And it was essentially Pharaoh, writ large. His prediction of what would replace God in the public square was just eerily prescient of what came next. And the underlying basis of it, I think, was best actually shown to us by Shakespeare. Shakespeare knew this years before. How this came about, you can actually see in the play Hamlet. I don't know if any of you have read Hamlet, seen Hamlet. You guys probably at least know the phrase, "to be or not to be, that is the question." And Shakespeare is one of those books, it's not as deep as the Bible, but man, you can read it 50 times and get something new out of it every single time. And so at the beginning of Hamlet, it says that Hamlet has just returned from Wittenberg. And most of us would miss that. Wittenberg is where Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Catholic Church. Wittenberg was the center of the Protestant Reformation of the church. And so Hamlet has come back from studying. He's young, full of his Protestant ideals, and he's immediately met, when he gets home, with the very Catholic ghost of his father. Because the Catholics had an answer for where ghosts come from. It's from purgatory. And so he's stuck in this, I just got done studying all this stuff, now my dad's dead, maybe his uncle my uncle killed him, and now I'm struggling with what is going on here. And that underlying struggle, I think, was Shakespeare recognizing what was going to play out in Western civilization up until our day. Prior to the Reformation, everybody agreed on the truth. If you asked what is truth, the answer was Christianity is true and the church says so. It was the church. Everybody agreed on that. And the point was spreading Christianity throughout the world. After the Reformation, for better or worse, there was no longer a single source of truth. The Protestants said Jesus is the truth. It says it in Scriptures. And the church said the church is the truth, right? The Catholic Church. And so, regardless of which one was right or wrong, there was this huge schism that the entire underlying foundation of truth was pulled out from under Western civilization at that point. It's not that the Catholic Church was right, it's that everybody agreed on it. And from that point forward, none of us would ever fully agree. And when we went to try to tell people Christianity is true, they now had to ask, whose Christianity? Right? We don't fully appreciate what a big change that made in the human mindset in the West. And the rest of Hamlet, I think, is Shakespeare's way of saying when you remove that single authority of truth, you end up descending into madness, to where you're even questioning existence itself. You no longer have that core objective reality that we all agree on, and Hamlet at one point is pretending to be mad, and he says that as to be or not to be, that is the question, right? Like we're questioning whether existence is even worth it. Where's the meaning in life? That was what came out of Hamlet, and we would struggle with that for the rest, and that's where you realize there's an inevitable meaninglessness to the godless West. Without God, there's no underlying meaning, and humans can't live without meaning, and that's where Nietzsche comes onto the scene. Nietzsche said, God is dead and we have killed him, and the ultimate meaning in life is the ability to have power over the world around you. You need to have power to control the things that happen to you, and the more you get that power, the more meaning you will have in life, and the purpose of your life is to acquire that power. In other words, Nietzsche said that the purpose of life is to be your own God. And so he defined someone called the Übermensch. Mensch is German for man. Über, of course, means all, overarching. He was called the Overman, the ultimate man. And the ultimate man would be completely characterized by what he called the will to power. That in the vacuum of meaninglessness that followed God's extraction from the public square, the Übermensch would swoop in, who was only worried about power, and he would win. Now, Nietzsche did not mean that the Übermensch would be a bad guy. He thought he'd be a good guy. But Nietzsche went mad and ended up dying, and it doesn't matter, because all of those later supermen driven by the will to power, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, they all read Nietzsche. And they all decided that that's where I'm going to get my meaning from. I'm going to be the Superman driven by the will to power. But they can only do so much evil on their own. So how did we get 150 million innocent civilians killed in the world where power was its own meaning? And that was the second thing that it's required for great evil that Pharoah also had. The tragedy comes when the truly evil person is able to amplify their evil through people who are not evil. The vast majority of people required for great evil to happen are normal people. They do not wake up every day looking for ways to hurt others like the truly evil do. But the normal people become a cog in a machine. They become a gear that has to turn. And the entire machine achieves the evil. The cog just knows its little job. It keeps the trains running on time. You get those people shoved into that train car. Keep the line of Jews moving. It's being shoved into the pit before the machine gunning starts. Make sure the cremation ovens get scrubbed. It is the bureaucrat that enacts the evil dictated from the Übermensch at the top. The marriage of the evil man to the efficient bureaucracy, absent any accountability to God, is what inflicts the most damage on the world. And that's what Pharaoh had. He had a bureaucracy built by 2,000 years. And he is now driven by the will to power, to drive empire. And he has a bureaucracy to carry out the killing of the babies and the enslavement of the Hebrews. And the best place, actually, that you can see this, if you've ever read Hannah Arendt's famous book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil, It was the architect of the Holocaust was Adolf Eichmann. And you expect Adolf Eichmann to look like a monster. I mean, he architected the death of 6 million Jews, about 6 million other people. The Holocaust was horrible. And the guy who made it all happen was this short, balding, accountant-looking man. And at his trial, she chose the word banality to describe him. He was bland. It came out in his trial, the man could not stand the sight of blood. He was just a bureaucrat who saw his job as keeping the trains running on time. In fact, he boasted at the trial that his greatest achievement was shipping 400,000 Hungarian Jews on trains in just a few weeks, a feat that he said had never been matched before or since. He was so proud of his bureaucratic acumen that resulted in all those Jews being murdered. And it was after reading that book that I realized the face of evil is not terrifying, it is bespectacled and bland. That the greatest evil mankind has ever produced was not actually the Übermensch, it was the bureaucrat. It's what the Russians call the apparatchik, the man of the apparatus. And somehow that's scarier, I think, than the great Superman of evil. So Pharaoh is this self-styled demigod. He is the Übermensch of his day. At the head of a bureaucracy built over 2,000 years. He's the Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. He is Western civilization that no longer knows the Christianity that built it. We are living under the Pharaoh, not under necessarily, but in the age of the Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. And so the question is, Western civilization is stuck struggling now with its godless meaninglessness, and it's unable to determine to be or not to be. It's questioning its own existence. Should we continue or not? You can see that played out before your very eyes right now. Nietzsche was eerily prescient, and it started right here with Pharaoh. But remember I said that you should not read history as the victim but the perpetrator? We're sitting here looking at all these other evil people. It's like, oh man, they're bad. Look at those guys. Before you cast the first stone at Pharaoh, recognize that first the ancient peoples valued the lives of infants a heck of a lot less than we do. And the reason primarily was practical. The vast majority of them died before age 2. In fact, most of the ancient civilizations did not name their children until they were 2 years old because they didn't want to get attached to them because they were very likely to die. So to them, it was sort of like, well, most of them are going to die anyways, so we'll just speed the process along here, throwing the babies in the river. At least in Pharaoh's case, he was convinced it was for the good of his people, right? Like there was some reason, as warped as it was. How many babies did he kill? Well, if we said there were 603,000 men of fighting age, let's say about half of them had babies in a given year, and about half of those were sons, because we were only killing the sons. That comes up to ballpark 150,000 babies, is what he would have killed. Now the midwives, of course, don't kill them, but they end up getting thrown in the river later anyways. It's 150,000. Last year in the United States, we murdered 1.13 million babies. And did we murder them because we were worried about protecting our people from foreign invaders? No. No, we murdered them so we could have sex without consequences. We murdered them so that they didn't cramp our lifestyle and force us to give up Starbucks to afford them. And how do we murder them? Do we throw them in the river to drown them in a matter of a few horrible seconds? No. No, we starve them with mifepristone. That's the abortion pill. Or we just vacuum them out and throw them away in a garbage can. In some cases, we saw them up and dismember them. As I was writing that 2 weeks ago, an article came across my feed from Cosmo magazine. Because I, of course, read Cosmo all the time, but I don't have any idea why I came across it. No, actually, it was a conservative commentator pointing out the evil of this article. Cosmo was very concerned there were some conservative areas in the country that were getting mifepristone considered illegal, that you couldn't give it to starve the baby anymore. And so, the way that you do the pill-based abortion is you take mifepristone, which spikes the progesterone, and it kills essentially the uterus lining that's feeding the baby, and it dies. And then you take, what's the name of the other one? It is misoprostol, to induce labor, and the baby comes out. The dead fetus comes out at that point in time. That's how you do it. Well, if the first one was illegal, Cosmo says, well, we don't need it. Their article said that it was titled Misoprostol Only Abortions. And it said, since those evil anti-abortionists were successful in making mifepristone illegal in some areas, then they could just take the misoprostol part of the pill-based abortion process. So instead of starving the baby first, we just induce the live fetus to come out and we throw it away in the garbage can now. Problem solved. You can go right back to having meaningless sex that has no consequences. That's the age that we live in. So, as I think the phrase that I'm going to use to refer to this line of thinking throughout the entire Bible is, we are Cain. In this story, we don't murder our babies to protect our nation from invaders. We murder them so we can have a few minutes of pleasure with random partners without having to raise children later. We are not the heroes of this story. We are the 70% of Germans who didn't vote for Hitler, or the Germans who didn't want Jews murdered, but they felt powerless against the bureaucracy to stop it. We are the Egyptians who weren't happy with the Pharaoh's campaign of evil while the bureaucracy put them to the whip and threw their babies in the river. Just don't become the cog in the machine. That's generally the most all of us normal people can do. But now that we're all depressed, and the story has dug us into a deep pit, seeing humanity as irredeemably bad, it's about to crack the facade of evil and light is going to shine in, because the Hebrew midwives are coming. So, we'll stop there. All right.